Timber Talks is brought to you by Wood Solutions. Stay up to date with the latest in timber, the building material that is strong, safe and sustainable. Here is your host, Adam Jones.
Sustainability is currently a trend around the globe, and Australia has signed to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, committing to keep global warming to below 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. The buildings industry has made a lot of progress in understanding the solutions of the operational energy side, which has historically been where most of the impacts have been. But as we make our buildings more energy efficient and also start using things like renewable energy, the proportion of impacts that come from the operational energy is decreasing, and therefore the proportion that is structural materials is actually increasing. So timber construction has a really big role to play in reducing the impacts of materials in our buildings, and therefore understanding the life cycle of these products is really essential. So this is what we're speaking today about with Ulrich Dangel, the Program Director for Architecture at the University of Texas and the author of a really good book, A Turning Point in Timber Construction, which goes on all about the different stages of a journey for a timber product. So I learnt a lot today, I'm sure you all will too. So without any further ado, we'll get into the interview with Ulrich.
Really, since the energy crisis in the 1970s, architects have really looked to making more energy efficient buildings. That means really reducing the operational energy consumption of buildings. And we have obviously over the decades since then, we have great improvements, and we've launched initiatives such as the passive house and net zero energy, even plus energy concepts. So we've really been able to bring down the operational energy of our buildings. But now with sustainability in building and architecture, and considering that about 40% of the energy consumed on the planet is due to construction, we're really starting to look at life cycle assessment and looking at a building's energy use over its entire life cycle. And we have been able to reduce the operational energy, but all of a sudden the embodied energy, which is the energy that is used to produce, process, and transport the building materials, all of a sudden that portion of the equation starts to be a lot more substantial. So while we've been able to create buildings that more or less generate more energy than they consume from an operational standpoint, the embodied energy is obviously kind of a fixed quantity that is embedded in the materials that form the structure. So the next step is really looking at reducing those embodied energy levels, and timber really shines there because it has a lot less embodied energy based on life cycle assessment studies than more conventional construction materials such as steel and concrete.
So when we use a timber product, we're obviously sourcing it from either plantations or forests. So what's some of the trends happening around the world when it comes to the forests, whether it be developing countries or developed countries?
So we've had a net reduction in forests, but we also then, and that's globally, but we also really need to break it down into specific regions. So obviously the temperate regions, which includes kind of a lot of the developed economies, North America and Europe, those regions have really experienced a deforestation a lot sooner than some of the other parts of the world, due to the fact that industrialization occurred there earlier than in other parts of the world. But so a lot of these regions actually retain very little of their original primary forests, and a lot of the forests that are grown there are secondary and tertiary forests. But since deforestation in those temperate regions occurred so early on, 200-300 years ago, these regions and the countries in those regions have been able to establish management practices that have ensured kind of a consistent timber stock. So as a result, the temperate regions of the world, which are mostly in the northern hemisphere, are actually experiencing an increase in forest cover, and most of the decrease in forest cover is actually occurring in the southern hemisphere and in a lot of the tropical developing countries. Those countries are responding to market demands and are capitalizing on new export opportunities. If you Brazil, which is the second largest soybean producer and the second largest beet producer in the world, there's a lot of land clearing occurring off primary rainforest to replace it with agricultural cropland and animal pasture land. And Indonesia, for example, which is a major supplier of palm oil, is experiencing the same thing. So it is actually economically driven, and a lot of forest land is cleared to make room for other land uses.
It seems like it's really important where you source your timber from, because we obviously don't want to be taking or increasing the demand of timber from places where it is maybe net deforestation. So can you tell us a little bit about the idea of what sustainable forest management is?
Yes, I mean sustainability and sustainable forest management really, as a guiding principle, was developed in 18th century European forestry regulations at a time when the early industrialization put a great strain and demand on wood as a building material and energy source. And the Europeans realized very early on that in order to ensure wood supply, they had to come up with a system to ensure sustainable supply for wood going forward, and not depleting and deforesting all the forests that they had. So these regulations have been in place for 300 years, and it's pretty much, kind of, to put it very simple, if you're looking at sustainable forest management, it's really about as simple as saying for every tree that you harvest, you plant another one, making sure you have supply going forward, and also for the future generations. Now, forest management, is obviously a little bit more complex than that, and it really looks at, and it really varies from region to region, but it has different concerns, and might look at obviously timber production for economic purposes, but might also focus on soil and watershed protection, biodiversity conservation, and then in many countries also cultural and recreational purposes. And I think to understand kind of managed forestry, we might have to talk about what an unmanaged forest is to begin with. So if you imagine an unmanaged forest is a forest that grows without any human intervention. So as the trees mature, they compete for water, sunlight, and nutrients, and that causes some of the trees to die while others prosper. And obviously, trees only have a certain lifespan. So it's at certain ages they just die off, but they just die off and become part of the underbrush. Also, as the number of trees and their age and diameter increase, there's a chance that natural disturbances can cause pretty severe impacts to forest stands. So let's say wildfire, storms, and insect infestation. As forests get denser, unmanaged forests, those natural disturbances can cause significant tree loss. There's nothing wrong with obviously not managing a forest, but since trees store a lot of carbon, not managing a forest can actually lead to significant carbon losses over time if entire forests burn down over time. And so what a managed forest does is it grows with human intervention. Again, the focus can vary. There are obviously different aspects that need to be considered, like I mentioned, timber production, and obviously biodiversity conservation. But a managed forest pretty much means that as trees mature, those older trees that actually at some point slow down in terms of their carbon absorption rate, those older trees are cut out and make room to grow. And as a result, the carbon dioxide that tree has captured during its lifetime is actually stored in the tree or in the wood product itself that's made out of that tree. And then we have a new generation of trees that can grow in its place and kind of renewing that cycle. There's a potential for a sustainably managed forest to provide much larger climate change mitigation benefits than an unmanaged forest can, due to the fact that the the older wood that has stopped absorbing carbon is taken out, but in the end, that carbon is sequestered in the trees, put into buildings, converted into building products, put into buildings, and then we can grow new products in its place.
Yeah, you've got a really interesting graph in your book where you show this. And as you said, for an older tree, as it approaches its the end of life, it kind of has diminishing returns in how much carbon it takes in. So once it's taken in all its carbon it can take in, and then you store that in a product, and then you plant a new tree, all of a sudden there's another rapidly absorbing tree that's taking carbon in as well. So if you manage it and through this cycle, you end up storing a lot more carbon through the managed forest, which is pretty much exactly what you were just describing.
Yes, and if once a timber building reaches the end of its life cycle, there's a possibility to repurpose the building material, the wood, and use it to make other building products. Or even in the worst case scenario, if you incinerate that wood as a biofuel, it will only release as much carbon into the atmosphere as the trees that were used to make the building products out of actually absorb during their lifespan. So we're actually not adding any carbon to the biogenic carbon cycle. And this is happening on a life cycle of a building within several hundred years. And the one thing that we've been doing with fossil fuels, we've been releasing by burning fossil fuels, we've been releasing carbon into the atmosphere that has accumulated and been stored in the Earth's crusts over millions of years. So we're really looking at a life cycle, at a carbon cycle that is a million-year life cycle rather than the decades or maybe centuries that you might experience with a biogenic life cycle if you use timber products or biofuels.
Like say right now, there's a big demand in the world for materials like cement and steel in our buildings. And say if timber going forward, which is right now showing a lot of potential, if it actually cuts into a chunk of that market share, there's obviously going to be a very big demand for wood. Do you think that where we are today is we can actually manage our forests to the point where we can actually supply a decent amount of timber in that regard?
Yes, I think we can. I think right now, especially in the northern hemisphere and some of the temperate forests, we're only using a fraction of the timber that's being grown there for construction. So there have been studies done in Germany and Europe that show that there's an enormous capacity for using more timber for construction without actually endangering the kind of sustainable forest management practices. So those forests in the temperate regions are already practicing sustainable forest management, and they're producing more timber than we can actually use right now. As the need for timber increases for building structures, I agree with you. I think we have to be careful. Where is that timber being sourced from? Is it sustainably sourced? So especially in some of the tropical regions where there's not a lot of forest certification at this point, we have to make sure that we can trace the product back to its source. There are alternatives to that, and there are plantation forests that are available. We have plantation forests in the northern hemisphere that are really just production forests. They're not the greatest in terms of offering biodiversity for species and habitat for different animal and wildlife, but they have the potential to alleviate the pressure that is being put on natural forests in terms of extracting resources. Now there are plantation forests in the southern hemisphere too, in the tropical regions, and the tropical regions obviously have climates that are very conducive to fast growth. Labor is relatively inexpensive. Land cost is relatively inexpensive. So there are a lot of plantation forests already established and being established in those regions. But the one thing we have to be really mindful about is what are these plantation forests displacing? Are they displacing primary forests that actually were we're very rich in terms of the animal habitats and biodiversity, or are plantation forests established or displacing ecosystems maybe of lesser value? I mean, China, for example, has afforestation programs where they're afforesting regions that not necessarily have grown trees in the past. So that would be putting the land to a higher use. But if we're displacing kind of the rich biodiversity and the habitat of primary forests or natural forests with plantation forests, then that would be a trend in the wrong direction. Although it is projected that plantation forests will make up more and more of the roundwood that is being used for construction. So we just need to make sure that these plantation forests are established in the right fashion, or they're not, being established at a cost of biodiversity and water quality and quality of life for the indigenous populations.
Interesting. So we've covered the forestry side of things, and now when it comes to manufacturing, is there a significant amount of operational energy used for the production of timber, and is there opportunities as well to use renewable energy to get these emissions in this part of the life cycle as low as possible?
Mm-hmm. So yes, I think that's a good point, because obviously wood biomass is about 50% carbon, and as soon as you obviously start cutting the tree and processing it into the product, you're using energy that is kind of counted against that carbon that is being stored in the material itself. So the energy required to manufacture finished wood products is generally less than about half of the amount that is stored in the wood products themselves. So in the end, you're still sequestering carbon with the wood product, even though you're using energy to process the wood itself. Also, the process in general is far less dependent on fossil fuels than the manufacturing of other building products. Since the forest industry generates much of its own energy through the combustion of mill residues, they actually use a lot of the cut-offs, the tree bark, the sawdust, and kind of the byproducts of pulping from paper making, and they actually use that in their own combined heat and power plants to run their operations. So kind of the numbers that I've seen is that about 70% of the energy that is being used to make wood products is using renewable energy, and obviously based out of incinerating wood as a biofuel. I mean, there is obviously still room to improve that and make it completely based on renewable energies. But compared to many other industries, they're already relying heavily on biofuels and renewable sources of energy for the production of their goods.
Mm. Okay, so say we've manufactured the product. Now, in the use of the product, what is the expected life cycle of a timber product? So, and how long can it actually store that carbon before we have to make decisions at the end of life?
Technically, the carbon that's stored in the wood product will be stored as long as that wood product exists. So, if you're putting it into a building and that building has a lifespan of 100 years, it could be 300 years. That carbon will be stored in the wood product for that amount of time. So it really kind of depends on your approach and your philosophy when it comes to designing and building the building. I mean, if you're kind of looking at how Europeans built their buildings, and that's really designed for 50 to 100 or 200 year life cycle, that's as long as the carbon will be stored in the building product as well. And it's really, a lot of times it's about obviously protecting the wood from moisture and other influences that might destroy it and kind of render the building unusable before its lifespan is up. And I think also the way buildings are assembled, especially timber buildings are assembled, can play a big role in terms of how the wood can actually be reused at the end of the building's life cycle. Timber, kind of through the possibility for high levels of prefabrication, really lends itself for designing it for deconstruction or disassembly by actually having mechanical fasteners and mechanical connections that can easily be dismantled at the end of a building service life, and then having those building products go to a higher use, potentially even be repurposed as structural members or finished products, cladding boards, floorboards, rather than just having to be shredded and being used as a biofuel. So really looking at mechanical connections rather than glues and adhesives that really impact the way a product can be reused at the end of its life cycle.
Yeah, and do you think there's more opportunities in that area with other like building information modeling and understanding exactly how the building's being built? So in 30 to 60 years time or whatever it might be, you can actually deconstruct it and start using all the products.
Yes, I definitely think that. I mean, I kind of have a book title in mind that I've been wanting to write, but I don't know if it'll ever happen. It's called Buildings Don't Have Manuals. Because if you think about it, a lot of the products that we buy, they come with a manual. And I mean, a lot of times we don't have those products for very long. Think about an iPhone, 3 to 4 years, or, other products we might have a little longer, but there's information tell us, potentially how to recycle that. I mean, if you look at the office furniture industry, they've kind of have a cradle-to-cradle approach, just like the automotive industry now has. So the problem with our buildings, the good thing with our buildings is they last for a long time, but the problem is also there's kind of embedded knowledge that gets lost. So I agree with you that building information modeling and actually embedding that kind of information into our building products, where you can actually then go in and understand how the building was put together, 50, 100, and 150 years ago, and then actually come back after that time and have a manual of how to disassemble and deconstruct the parts. I think that's definitely something that's going to be happening in the future.
And so we're approaching the end of life of a product. You've mentioned briefly what some of the options are, but can you just let us know what are all the options that you might go down and some of the benefits and negatives of each?
So yeah, there are several options for recycling or repurposing wood products at the end of their service life. Starting with the lowest one of those would be just incinerating the product as a biofuel for energy generation. But even in that worst case scenario, the wood product that is incinerated there only releases as much carbon back into the atmosphere as the tree itself has absorbed during its lifetime from the atmosphere. So it kind of closes the biogenic carbon cycle. Ideally, what we would do is we would not have to, downcycle a product like that, but we would be able to use connectors that allow easy disassembly, and then repurposing products and putting them to a higher use and giving them a second life, even if it is in form of maybe taking a structural product, a beam or a column, and then using it for non-structural purposes later, kind of as in their second life. There are obviously adhesives in a lot of these wood products. I mean, the content, the percentage of that is relatively small in a glue lam. You're probably looking at about 1% of the overall mass of the glue lam itself will be adhesive. In a more engineered wood product, such as laminated strand lumber or OSB, or in its strand board, you're probably looking at 6 to 7%. So the content gets a little higher. There's obviously concern, these are obviously, most of these are chemically based adhesives right now. So obviously incinerating those will obviously cause other emissions that are not coming from the wood product, from the wood itself, but from kind of the adhesives that were used. So there are concerns there, but there is a lot of ongoing research that is looking at bio-based adhesives, soy-based adhesives, and so on, that make these wood products really completely biodegradable and environmentally friendly wood products, so that also at the end of their life cycle, whether they're being incinerated or whether they just rot and decompose, the impact on the environment is very, very low.
Fantastic. All right, so I feel like we've tracked the whole timber product from the forest right through to its end of life. What do you see as the future of timber construction in the next few decades?
I'm thinking you see a lot of the big companies, a lot of the big tech companies, especially in the United States, they're really trying to appeal to their employees and hiring the best talent. And a lot of these people are increasingly looking at working in healthy work environments, and timber actually can play a very important role there in making sustainable buildings that are also healthy, that also create healthy indoor environments. So a lot of these companies are realizing that, and they're starting to build mass timber buildings. So I think that's just going to increase as obviously some of these companies are kind of at the forefront of the development, but as smaller companies and corporations jump on board, and occupants and users and consumers start to realize what the health benefits are and the environmental benefits are of building these buildings and living in these buildings, I think we're just going to continue to replace some of our more carbon intensive building materials with timber. There is a trend that's actually also ironically partially caused by global warming, which most of the structural wood products that we're using are historically made from softwoods, coniferous trees, but conifers are actually not quite as resilient in terms of resisting temper or adapting to increasing temperatures as deciduous trees, hardwoods are. So there is an ongoing development in actually changing the forest mix, where more deciduous trees, more hardwoods are being grown, which historically hardwoods have not been used for structural purposes. They have mostly been used for making furniture, finished materials such as flooring, or in the worst case, just used as a biofuel. So there is ongoing development in making structural timber products out of those hardwoods and really putting those hardwoods to better use. And so it's really kind of goes all the way back to forest management, kind of ensuring a healthy forest mix of deciduous and coniferous trees that can be resilient and can withstand climate change, but then also at the same time also being able to putting that wood to its best possible use as a structural wood product in making buildings.
If you want to learn more about wood, I suggest that you go and check out the Wood Solutions website. It's the world's biggest website on wood, and there you will also find the Wood Solutions technical design guides. So if you've got any questions, I'm sure you will find the answers there.